Okay, so yesterday we stopped at this particular slides on the image demosaicing. We say that, okay, the whole process of CFA demosaicing is because, right, first we explain why do we need to have a CFA. Okay, the reason why we need to have a CFA is because, right, for most digital camera, you only have one sensor, okay? Whereas the color information that you have that come in has 3 channels. So somehow you must devise a scheme that can capture these 3 channels of color information, okay, onto a sensor. That's why we introduced this particular CFA. So for this CFA array, what will happen is that, right, you have a CFA array such as a base pattern like this, right? Okay, that consists of different filter of different color. So for each filter, it will only allow one color to pass through. For example, this green filter will only allow green light to pass through. Okay, the red filter will only allow the red light to pass through. Okay, so if you place a CFA in front of the sensor, so at the end, when you capture this particular signals at the image sensor, what you have is that, right, as we have explained, at each of the pixel location, you will only be capture one color component. It's either green, red, or blue, right? Okay, so from this sample information, namely 1 pixel, you only have 1 color information. If you want to recover the full color image, you must try to estimate the missing color. For example, for this pixel here, right, you need to estimate the missing blue and the missing red color, right, for you to reconstruct the whole image. Okay, so that particular process of trying to estimate the missing color for each pixel is known as demosaicing. So there's various algorithms or technique that has been developed to perform demosaicing. Some simpler but not so sophisticated. Some more sophisticated, but the results are actually better. Right, so there's various demosaicing algorithm. Right, okay, some simple technique will work okay for smooth region, but not so good in the edge region that contains some detailed information. So obviously, some more sophisticated technique will produce better results. Okay, so this is pretty much to recap what we have discussed last week, yesterday regarding this CFA demosaicing. Right, so in last lecture, I also mentioned that for typical digital camera, you only have 1 sensor array, okay, or 1 image sensor. But for some of the more high-end digital camera that you probably have heard of before is, for example, you have 3 CCD or 3 CMOS kind of a camera. For those camera, what it means is that actually instead of 1 image sensor, you are going to have 3 image sensor. Okay, such that each of the image sensor can be used to capture each of the color component or color channel, right? Okay, so for those type of camera which use, for example, 3 CCD or 3 CMOS, it has 3 separate image sensor, right? Each one will take a separate color component, right? So for example, in this case here, when you have the light coming in, it's going to go through a prism. And then this prism assembly is going to split the light into 3 components, okay, the red, the green, and the blue. For example, in this case, red, green, and blue. And then afterwards, each of the image sensor, right, is going to capture each different color component. So in this case, you'll be able to capture all the information. Therefore, the quality of the image that you capture by right should be superior to the previous one that uses CFA, okay? Right, okay, often after you have performed the CFA demosaicing, for example, for the typical camera where you have 1 image sensor, right, you need to perform the CFA demosaicing. After you have performed the CFA demosaicing, you'll see that the color sometimes is still a little bit off. For example, right, this is 1 image, right, that you have performed the CFA demosaicing already. So you recover 3 channels of the color. That means you recover all the 3 channel information of the image. However, if you look at this particular image, you see that the color is a little bit off. Okay, the color is a little bit off. The reason why sometimes, right, the image that you capture, the color is a little bit off, is because you know that given a particular imaging scene, how it will appear will often depends on what kind of condition the image is being acquired. Okay, for example, different lighting source. If you have a particular object, right, you try to capture the image of this object either under, for example, slightly yellow lighting, or under the filaments, under fluorescence tube that you have at home. For different lighting condition, right, for this particular image, it may turn out to be a little bit different. Okay, so because of this inconsistency, okay, in the appearance of the image due to different lighting conditions, such as the weather, the time, or different lighting source, you will need to have an extra step to correct or to make the color adjustment or correction. Okay, so that's why you have a need to perform this color correction or color adjustment. Okay, so there's various steps involved in performing color correction. Some of them is actually quite sophisticated, so we don't really have to go too much into detail. But a few common one of them is called white balancing. Okay, so the idea of white balancing is very simple. You pretty much just want to make sure that a particular object that is white in color, okay, in physical sense, you have a physical white paper. When you capture an image, it should appear to be white, okay, rather than a little bit yellowish or greenish. Okay, so this process of making sure that the white physical object will appear exactly to be white is called white balancing. So you can see in this case, after you apply white balancing, this region, for example, which is supposed to be white in color, now will turn out to be white now. Okay, and then there are also other color correction or adjustment steps that you can further apply. Okay, for example, gamma correction to further improve the color fidelity of the captured images. Right, so earlier on we mentioned about this white balancing. So idea of white balancing is very simple. Essentially, an object that's white in color, when you capture, it should turn out to be white, right, when you take the photo. Right, okay, so that's why it's mentioned here. The white balancing is used to adjust the color to match the color of the light source so that a white object will appear to be white. So this is the whole purpose of performing this white balancing here. So pretty much there's two ways you can do this white balancing. You can either let the camera do the automatic white balancing for you, or you can manually select which mode you want to choose. So pretty much there's two types of white balancing. One is the automatic white balancing, right? The other is you can manually select what mode you want to choose. So if you let the camera do the automatic selection for you, what it does is that the camera will try to look at the overall color composition of the image you have captured. They'll use some algorithm to do some estimation and then do the correct rendering itself. Okay, so that's if you let the computer or you let the camera do the automatic white balancing for you. Or if you want, you can do it yourself, right? Because you know that for that particular image that you are trying to capture, you know that what kind of condition is under, right? It could be that you may be capturing the image during daylight or cloudy condition, or you are probably capturing the image under the typical fluorescence. So if you know what kind of light source, you can manually select this particular one of the option, okay? And then this will actually give you a better confidence of providing the correct white balancing. Okay. Right, so this particular slide show you right, the impact, right? So given a particular object, okay, with white on top of a white paper here, so if you try to capture this image under different lighting condition, okay, for example, under this fluorescence light, okay, those light that you have at home, or under those film, those old light bulb that you have, you can see it looks a little bit different. In particular, if it's fluorescent, it will appear to be a bit greenish. For those of you who have played with camera before, you'll probably observe this as well. So you can see that the same object under different lighting condition or weather condition, it turned out to be a little bit different. Right, that's why you need to apply different setting or the white balancing to correct it, to make sure that what is white should appear to be white. Okay? Right, so the next thing that we are going to look at is the ISO sensitivity. So ISO sensitivity essentially is the sensitivity of the image sensor with respect to the light. So if the ISO sensitivity, or also known as the ISO rating, if the ISO rating of a particular image sensor is high, that means it's very sensitive to light. Okay? If the ISO rating is small, that means it's not so sensitive to light. Okay? So later on, we'll see a little bit more about it. But first, let's look at this particular example here. So in this case here, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to capture an image of someone cycling. So when you think of cycling, that means this particular imaging scene is moving quickly or slowly. Okay? When someone is cycling, what do you think? This particular imaging scene, is it moving quickly or slowly? Chances is quickly. Huh? So if this particular object is moving quickly, right, when you take a picture, should you use a slow shutter speed or high shutter speed? You should use a high shutter speed, right, or faster shutter speed. Because shutter speed, if you recall what we discussed yesterday, is that usually when the light come in, right, into a digital camera, the shutter most of the time is closed. But it will be open for a small fractions of the time, right, so that the light will come in and hit the image sensor so that the image can be acquired. So most of the time shutter is closed, it will only be open for a small fraction of time. So what happens is, if your shutter is open for a long duration of time, okay, if your shutter is open for a long duration of time, as this person is moving, okay, you can see that, right, you have light source coming as this bicycle is moving. The light source from a few points will be hitting the same particular pixel location of the image sensor, right? Because it's moving, right? So a few light ray will be hitting the same pixel location, right? Hence, this will create blurring effect, right? So what I'm trying to say is that, in short, if you want to capture an image that's moving fast, you have to make sure that your shutter is only open for a very short fraction of time, okay, to prevent the blurring effect, okay? So in this case here, therefore, you can see, if you want to capture an image that's moving fast, we have to use a fast shutter speed, okay, so as to prevent blurring. However, if you are using a very fast shutter speed, that means the shutter is only open for a short period of time. In order to compensate for that, right, that means now your image sensor should be you should make your image sensor more sensitive. Am I right? Because if the shutter is open for a short period of time, that means only a small amount of light will go into the image sensor, okay? And therefore, in this case, you have to make sure that your image sensor has high ISO sensitivity, so that even a small amount of light will be sufficient to provide, will be able to provide sufficient brightness, okay? Right, okay, so this, as opposed to this, if you use a slow shutter speed, right, you can see you are going to get the image blurring, okay? If you use a slow shutter speed, that means the shutter will be open for a longer duration of time, then you can afford to use a lower ISO sensitivity for your image sensor. Okay, so anyway, most of the things I mentioned is captured in this particular slide here. Right, earlier on, as I mentioned to you, ISO sensitivity, all right, or the ISO rating of the image sensor is a measure of how sensitive the particular image sensor is with respect to light. Okay, so ISO rating indicates the light sensitivity of the image sensor. So the higher number, okay, means that your camera image sensor is more sensitive to light. Okay, so if you use a higher ISO rating, your image sensor is more sensitive to light. That means actually you can afford to capture an image in a dark environment, because a little bit of light will be able to provide sufficient brightness okay, for your captured image if you use a high ISO rating. Right, okay, you can also afford to use if you use a high ISO rating, you can also afford to use a smaller aperture. Okay, because a smaller aperture will actually, by right, it will reduce the amount of light coming in. But because if your ISO rating of the image sensor is high enough, is sensitive enough, then it will still be able to compensate and provide sufficient brightness of your captured image. Okay, so if you use high ISO rating, you can also use a faster shutter speed. Okay. Right. So actually, this part here is a little bit like the basics of digital photography. So even though if you may not be familiar with photography, by going through some of these slides here, you probably have a basic understanding of how a camera works and also some of the the proper response or what action should you take to capture a good quality image. Right. So from the previous discussion previously, it may appear to you that okay, so ISO rating is actually an indication of sensitivity of the camera or the image sensor. So does it mean that higher ISO rating is always better? Okay. So the question is that, is it that high sensitivity or high ISO rating is always better? Okay, the answer is actually given here. Okay, high sensitivity or ISO rating is not necessary, is not always better. Okay, actually it has both advantages as well as disadvantages. Right. Okay, so if you look at it, right. So these particular slides here or these figures here show you the relative advantages and disadvantages of using different settings of ISO rating. So you can see for this diagram here, this end here is low ISO rating. Okay, this end here is high ISO rating. All right. Okay, so this is low, this is high. So if you use a low ISO rating, early on you know that means your sensor is less sensitive to light. Okay, your sensor is less sensitive to light. However, some of the advantages as well as disadvantages are given here. Okay, for low ISO rating, okay, the image that you capture tends to be more vivid. Okay, the color tends to look better. Okay, as compared to if you capture an image using high ISO rating. Right, so this is considered as advantages of using low ISO rating. The next one is this grain here. If you use low ISO rating, right, the image tends to be smoother. Okay, if you use high rating, okay, it tends to be a bit more noisy. Okay, and sometimes you also call it grainy. Okay. The next thing is that, right, if you use a low ISO rating, usually your image tends to be blurred. Okay, why is it tends to be blurred? Because if you use low ISO rating, that means usually your shutter need to be open for a longer period of time for you to get enough light to get the exposure. So if your sensor is open for a longer period of time, that means it tends to be blurred. Okay, that's why if you use low ISO rating, your image tends to be blurred. Okay, as opposed to using high ISO rating, it's harder to blur. And then finally, right, okay, if you use low ISO rating, right, your image is harder to focus. Right, okay, the reason is because if you use a low ISO rating, that means your aperture has to be smaller or larger. If you use a low ISO rating, that means your image sensor is not so sensitive to the light. If the image sensor is not so sensitive to the light, your aperture has to be smaller or larger. Has to be a larger. So if your aperture is larger, in later slides you will learn that if your aperture is larger, then the depth of field usually tends to be more narrow. Okay? Depth of field is the range of the distance where the image will appear to be in focus or in sharp. Right. So if you use a larger aperture, your depth of field will be smaller. If the depth of field is smaller, that means it's harder for you to focus, right, to make it sharp. Right. Anyway, some of them we'll cover a little bit later. So in short, this particular slides here just show you that, right, using high ISO or low ISO rating both has its advantages as well as disadvantages. So this slide here shows you, right, for example, if you are capturing an image, right, with different ISO rating, as you increase the ISO rating, you can see that the image become more noisy and more grainy as compared to low ISO rating, right? So which confirmed early on about this particular point, okay? Higher ISO rating, the image will become more grainy or more noisy. Okay, next we'll look at resolution. I think in previous lecture we already talked about resolution. So resolution is nothing but the total number of pixels in a particular image. Okay, the total number of pixels in a particular image. So usually higher resolution means it will give you better quality image. Right, in this context here, what they're trying to show you is that, okay, higher resolution also means that more cropping flexibility. Essentially, higher resolution means that you are packing in more pixels, okay, into the image. Okay, you are packing in a lot more pixels into an image and, for example, this region. So if you look at an image with 4 megapixels, 6 and 8 megapixels for the original image, right? If you try to crop this particular region and then you try to zoom it in, you can see that image with higher resolution will be able to provide you more fine details. Okay, right? Because essentially it just simply means that for this region, if you use a higher resolution, you pack more pixels inside it. So when you crop it, you enlarge it, you'll still be able to preserve a lot of the detailed information. Okay, so this slide actually covers some of the basic information about resolution. So earlier on in previous lecture, we already learned that resolution is nothing but the pixel count, right? Okay, so resolution is nothing but the total number of pixels in the captured image, right? Okay, so it depends on this particular image sensor size, right? In 2 years ago, typical kind of range of the resolution is from 6 to 12 megapixels, but now it probably has already moved much higher. Okay, another concept that you all should know is when you talk about images and TV is aspect ratio. So aspect ratio is the ratio of width over height. Okay, width over height, right? So that's the meaning of aspect ratio. So when you go and, for example, watch a movie, nowadays, most of the movies are widescreen. So widescreen means that it has an aspect ratio of 16 to 9. Okay? Right, for your old TV, maybe when you are a kid, the old TV that you're watching has an aspect ratio of 4 to 3. Okay? And for most photos that you have, right, the aspect ratio is usually, for example, in 3 to 2 ratio. Right. So this particular slides here just try to give you some intuition, right, about, if you are trying to print out some digital photo, how many pixels is necessary, okay, for you to provide sufficient details for this photos here. Right, okay, suppose that, assuming that you're trying to print photos of this aspect ratio, 3 to 2 aspect ratio, with 200 to 300 pixels per image. Usually for most application, right, for our viewing kind of quality, 200 to 300 pixels per inch is already sufficient, right? It's already quite sufficient. So what we can see is that, okay, right, so if you use this particular aspect ratio of this photo, right, for these different types of resolution, pixel per inch, right, you can see that if you use the 2 megapixels of image, you can actually print up to about 6 inch by 4 inch, okay? And if you use a 4 megapixels, you can print up to even 8 inch by about 5.4 inch, right? If you use a camera with a resolution of 22 megapixels, that means actually you can print up to, okay, 19 inch by close to 13 inch. So this slide, essentially what it's trying to show is that for typical application, for example, if what you are trying to do is simply to print a photo, right? You don't really need to go to such a high resolution, right? If you print a typical photo, which is about this size, okay, 6 inch by 4 inch, that kind of size, actually 2 megapixels is probably more than enough already. Okay? So higher resolution probably is a little bit like an overkill. Okay, so as I mentioned to you before, sharpness provided by 200 to 300 pixels per inch is probably sufficient already. Right, so whether you want to use a higher pixels per inch or lower will depend on different application. For example, if you are trying to produce a poster for a movie, you probably want to use a higher PPI, okay? Because you want the high quality posters. Right, okay, so digital camera nowadays come with a very high resolution. Okay, so the good thing about having a very high resolution is that you can easily enlarge it or crop it, and you can still preserve the high quality. Okay, but the disadvantage is that, right, for higher resolution camera, usually it tends to be more expensive, and then you need more storage to store each image. So those are the advantage as well as the disadvantage. Right. So the next thing we're going to look at is shutter. Right, so I think in previous lecture, actually we already introduced this concept of shutter. So this shutter is given here. So for example, when you're trying to take an image or photos of a particular imaging scene here, right, so what you have is that, all right, this is the image sensor, and this is a shutter. And the shutter is closed most of the time. So when you try to press this particular shutter button a little bit, when you press it halfway down, right, what it will try to do is this camera will try to analyze this imaging scene, and then it will decide what is the proper aperture setting as well as the shutter speed, okay, to give the proper exposure of the imaging scene. So afterwards, when you are ready, you can further press this particular button to take a picture. So you press it, the shutter will be opening. So it opens, the light from this particular imaging scene will be captured by the image sensor, and then the image will be formed. Right, okay. So to capture an image, of course, the sensor needs to be exposed to the light. So earlier on, as I mentioned to you, the shutter, okay, will block the light from the sensor. So until you press it. So when you press it, the shutter will open quickly, okay, and then it will give the sensor a short duration to be exposed to the light to form the image. Okay, so for camera, there's two ways you can control the light. One is the aperture, the other is known as the shutter speed. So the aperture is nothing but, this how big, okay, how big the particular diaphragm, okay, and the shutter speed is how long the shutter will be open. Right. So if you use the camera to do the automatic exposure, so usually, I think for most of you, you have taken photo before, so you should know what's the steps. So first of all, you try to frame your subject. Namely, you try to look at it, and you try to aim at the object you're trying to capture the image. Okay, and then you press the shutter button halfway down. You press it a little bit. For most of you, you probably have tried before. You press it a little bit down. So the reason why you need to do that is that you tell the camera that you are about to capture an image already. So when the camera knows that you're about to capture an image, it will try to analyze this imaging scene you are trying to capture, and then it will do a proper calculation to see how big is the aperture it should open, and how fast the shutter should be open. Okay? For example, if the object in front is moving very quickly, then the shutter speed should be very fast, and the aperture should be a little bit bigger to provide the proper exposure. Okay? So once it has analyzed, then you can further press it down. Okay? You can press the shutter button the rest of the way to take the picture. So even though you may not know exactly what happened, but internally this is how the camera handles it. Right, okay, so earlier on I mentioned that there's two factors that can determine how much light enter the camera and hence determine the exposure of the image. So one of them is aperture. Right, so aperture, okay, is nothing but the opening of this particular diaphragm here. So this is the aperture setting here. Right, so it will allow how much light get into the camera here. Okay, so this aperture setting is similar to the pupil in the human eyes, right? Okay, so you let allow the camera to control the amount of light that enter into the camera. Okay, so technically for most of in a digital camera, right, when we want to describe what is the size of the this aperture, right, we use the term f-stop, right, f-stop number. So f-stop number is a way to describe, okay, how big is the opening of this aperture here, right? Okay, so if you look at this f-stop number, so this f-stop number is a measure of the size of the aperture opening, right? Okay, so if you look at this particular diagram here, right, if you have a larger f-stop number, okay, it turns out that the aperture opening is smaller, okay? Larger f-stop number means smaller opening, okay? And smaller f-stop number means the aperture or the opening is larger. So this is one inverse relationship you probably need to pay some attention. So you can see larger f-stop number, 16, okay, the aperture is smaller. And a smaller f-stop number, for example, 2, you can see the aperture now is large. So if you are using a smaller f-stop number like this, okay, you'll see that the opening or the aperture will be larger. If it's larger, that means more light will go through, and then the exposure of your camera later will be higher. That means it's brighter, okay? Right, okay, so the second factor that will decide how much light get into your image is the shutter speed. Right, so the shutter speed is measured by, okay, the amount of time is open. Right, so typically you use numbers such as, a speed of 1/60 means that your shutter is open for 1/60 seconds here. Okay, so this particular diagram here show you, right, if you use a different shutter speed, right, okay, the kind of light that can pass through your camera. So if your aperture, if your shutter is open for 1 second, you can see or imagine a lot of light is going to get through, so it's going to become very bright. Okay, this is as opposed to if your shutter speed is very fast, okay, open only for 1/1000 fraction of a second, then the amount of light getting through the camera is very small. Okay, so in summary, okay, slower shutter speed means that more light can get into the camera. Higher shutter speed means less light. Okay, so right early on, we mentioned that, okay, there's two factors you can decide on this exposure of an image, right? So one is aperture, which is, how big is the opening, right? And then it's described by f-stop number. The other is the shutter speed, that means how fast you open up the shutter. So you may be thinking, all right, so you have these two factors that you can play with, right? That can determine how much exposure and the quality of the image. So the question now is that, how do you balance between these two factors, right? How do you balance between the shutter speed and the aperture? So when should you use a faster shutter speed or when use slower one? And when should you use a larger aperture setting and when smaller? So those are the questions you have to ask yourself, and each will have its own implication. So essentially, to summarize what we have said before is that, for example, exposure is these two factors combined. All right, the shutter speed and the f-stop setting, right, which is the aperture opening, right, these two factors will decide, how much exposure your image will receive. So if you look at these three images here, you can see these three images all have the same amount of exposure. That means the same amount of brightness for this image here. But you can see that they are actually using different combinations of the f-stop number and the shutter speed. Okay, you can see that these three combinations of f-stop number and shutter speed will give you these three images. Okay, so can anyone tell me why is it that for this particular imaging scene, this particular setting appear to be the best? Anyone? Okay. Let me just say it again. Right, you can see that for this particular example here, you have 3 images. Okay, these 3 images are acquired using these 3 different combinations of aperture setting and shutter speed setting. Right, but why is it that for these 3 images, this one gives you the best visual quality? Why? Why? Anyone want to take a guess? Right, the first thing that you notice in this case is that, okay, you can see the shutter speed that you use to capture these 3 images. The first one is 1/4 seconds. The next one is 1/30. The next one is 1/250. 1/250. Right. So based on this information, can you know, it provides some hint. Okay, what's happening? Essentially. Okay, can anyone guess? Yeah, I think pretty much you give the correct answer to the questions already. Okay, the reason why in this particular instance here, right, this particular combinations of the this aperture and the shutter speed setting give the best result is, right, okay, actually for this particular imaging scene, the couple is actually moving. So when it's moving, you need to make sure that your shutter speed is very fast, right, so that your shutter speed only open for a small fraction of time, right, so that the image will not be blurred. Okay, so that's why between these 3, if the object or the imaging scene is moving, you need to have a fast shutter speed. But now, if you are using a fast shutter speed, that means it's only open for a small duration of time. In order for you to have sufficient exposure or brightness, you need to make sure that your aperture should be large or small. It should be large to compensate, okay, for a shorter duration of the shutter being open. That is why you notice that in this case here, right, okay, your f-stop number is small, because small f-stop number means that your aperture opening is large, okay, to counter, okay, this particular effect to provide sufficient exposure to the image, okay. Right. So the next few slides, we are going to cover a few standard kind of exposure setting. If you have played with a digital camera before, you'll see that on top or somewhere there's one of the knob here. Okay. So this knob here, you have a few different alphabets here. For example, M, S, A, and P. So what does these letters represent? Okay. So the next few slides is trying to answer the question, right? So we are trying to capture an image. There's a few different exposure settings you can set yourself. Right, the first one that you have is known as aperture priority auto exposure. So aperture priority auto exposure is also known as a mode A. So this A, this letter A comes from this word aperture. So for aperture priority auto exposure, what you are doing is that the user would decide, okay, what is the aperture setting you want to set. Okay. The user make the decision whether you want to have a small aperture opening or large one. Okay. So once the user decided whether he want to use a small opening or large opening, afterwards the camera will take over and decide, okay, how fast the shutter speed should be. Okay. So the idea therefore is actually very simple. Right. For aperture priority auto exposure, the user or the photographer will specify the aperture or the opening. Okay, and then you let the camera decide the shutter speed to produce the proper exposure so that you have sufficient brightness. So you may ask, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to have this kind of aperture priority auto exposure? Anyone? Anyone? Okay. Right, the answer to that is actually later on in one of the slides we'll explain a little bit later. Right. But, okay, when you change aperture, earlier on, I also briefly touched on it. When you change your aperture, right, what it will impact is that it will affect what we call as the depth of field. Okay, when your aperture opening is small, okay, the depth of field will be large. Okay, when your aperture opening is large, your depth of field will be small. So sometimes when you capture an image, you really want to make sure that, right, whether the background, okay, the background that you have will appear to be in focus or not. Sometimes you just want to, for example, focus on this particular bottle alone. Okay, you just want to focus on this bottle alone. You want this particular bottle to be sharp, but you want the background to be blurred. If you want this particular object to be sharp, okay, and the background to be blurred, the depth of field should be small or large. No, if you want your focus to be on this object, you want this object to appear to be sharp or in focus, but you don't want it to be distracted by the background. Okay, for those cases, your depth of field should be large or small. Your depth of field should be small, huh? Your depth of field should be small, so you only focus on this particular object. So when your depth of field is small, that means now your aperture setting should be large or small. Should be large. Huh? So you can see that, therefore, it really depends on what kind of a visual quality you want. Right? If you want the object to, only this small object to be in focus, the background is not distracted by background, you use a small depth of field, and hence you use a large aperture opening. The reverse is that if you use a small aperture opening, then your depth of field will be large. That means both this object as well as the background will appear to be in focus, and therefore they are sharp. Okay? Right. So I know I say quite a lot, but essentially what it means is that by changing or making decision on this aperture setting, you can decide the depth of field. Okay? How much you want the particular scene to be in focus or not. Right, okay, the next one is shutter priority auto exposure. Okay, it's called mode X, taking from this word S here. Right, by the same token, now you can more or less guess. Okay, shutter priority auto exposure in this case means that the photographer will decide how fast the shutter is open. Okay, the photographer decide how fast the shutter is open, and the camera then will decide what is the proper aperture to provide sufficient exposure. Okay, so which is given here. Right, so the photographer will decide the shutter speed, and then the camera will decide the aperture setting to provide sufficient exposure. Okay, the reason why sometimes you may want to do that is because if you know that the particular imaging scene you're trying to capture is moving very fast, okay, rather than letting the camera make the decision, you make the decision yourself. If I know the object is moving fast, I must use very fast shutter speed, right, to freeze the particular motion. Therefore, if that's the case, then you should choose this particular mode rather than letting the camera make the decision for you. Okay? Right, of course, if you don't want to know any of this, right, for most people, they just simply don't want to know any of this thing. They can always use the program auto mode. Right? So you just choose P. The camera will do all the calculation for you. But of course, sometimes what the camera thinks is the best for you need not necessarily be what you want. Okay, that's why, it will always be good to have some understanding of how the camera works, and then you can do the right decision and choose the best setting. Okay, but overall, if you don't really want to worry about all those things, you choose this, mode P, or program auto exposure. You let the camera decide the proper aperture and the shutter speed to capture an imaging scene. Okay, right. However, if you are really truly professional, you may want to have control of both the aperture setting, okay, as well as the shutter speed setting. Then you choose this mode called mode M here. Okay, so for mode M, stand for manual, right? The user can choose both the aperture as well as the shutter speed setting. So therefore, you can decide whether the object that you try to capture is fast moving or not, whether you want this particular depth of field to be small or large. Okay, you can control all the possible combination. Right. Okay, so an important issue when you're trying to capture an image is that you need to provide sufficient exposure. Okay, why is it that it's important that your image should have sufficient exposure? Because an underexposed image will be very dark. That's why you need to make sure that the image you capture always have sufficient exposure. Right. However, sometimes when you let the computer or you let the camera do the exposure for you, they may not be able to do exactly what you want. Right. So on top of that, therefore, you can actually further make some adjustment, okay, to this particular camera to tell them to provide more exposure or not. So how you can do it is by using this what is known as exposure compensation. Right. So in your camera, actually, right, you can further adjust this particular exposure by adjusting this value called exposure value. Okay? So I believe tonight if you go home, if you have a camera, you just go and play around with it. Definitely you'll come across this EV number. So this EV number, you can adjust it to be, typically its value is between +2, okay, to -2. So if you adjust the value to be large, you'll make sure that this particular exposure is larger. It will become brighter. If you decrease the EV value, okay, the exposure will reduce accordingly. All right, okay, I think. So this particular slide pretty much just tell you the story. Right, okay, so if you increase the EV value, all right, it will become brighter and more exposure. If you reduce the EV value, it will become darker and less exposure. Right, okay, sometimes if you really feel so uncomfortable, right, you do not know exactly what kind of exposure you are trying to get, because sometimes you do not know exactly what you're looking for. Then what you can do is that you can choose one feature called automatic bracketing. Okay, automatic bracketing. So for this particular feature called automatic bracketing, what it does is that when you press a particular button, the camera will actually capture a series of images with different exposure. Okay, you'll capture a series of images with different exposure, so that afterwards you can choose what is the one that you like. Okay, so if you like this one, you just choose this one. Okay, so this is one of the feature that will make sure that at least one of the image will be having the exposure that you want. Okay, for many of the smarter camera nowadays, you also have the scene mode. Right, so for scene mode, what it means is that if you already know what kind of image you are trying to capture, whether it's portrait, whether it's landscape and sports modes and so on, right, you can tell the computer or this particular camera so. Right, so then this camera will take it into consideration when you try to adjust or select the proper aperture and shutter speed setting. All right, okay. So let me just quickly cover one or two more slides. Right, the next component we are going to talk about is lens. Right, so some of the concepts we are going to talk about or study is one, depth of field. The next one is focal length and the difference between optical and digital zoom. Right, so here we'll try to quickly introduce you the concepts of depth of field. So early on, actually, we already touched on this depth of field. So what is a depth of field here? Right, okay, first of all, what is this focus here? Okay, a focus is pretty much a particular point or location or plane in the physical world, whereas when the image appears on the camera, it will appear to be sharp. Right, so this is the focus here, right, the focus of the particular object. Okay, but in practice, when you are using a camera to capture an image, instead of one point in the physical location that will stay being focused or sharp, what you have is that you have a range of distance. Okay, you have a range of distance, whereas any object that falls within this range of distance will appear to be sharp, okay, or in focus when you capture the image. So this is the concept of depth of field. Depth of field is nothing but the range of distance, whereas any object that falls within this distance will appear to be sharp or in focus when you capture it. So what's the relationship between this depth of field and the aperture setting? So early on, actually, I already explained this, but this slide actually gives you the complete picture. Right, so if you use a small f-stop number, small f-stop number means that your aperture opening will be large. Okay, large aperture opening. If you have a large aperture opening, then your depth of field will be small. Okay? This is as opposed to if you use a large f-stop number, okay, then your aperture opening will be small. If your aperture opening will be small, your depth of field will be large. So you can see in this case here, this whole objects here will appear to be sharp here. Okay, as opposed to in this case here, only this particular bird will be sharp, this will be appear to be blurred. Right, so this is a demonstration. Of course, we can look at one particular example to further drive home this message here. So earlier on, as I mentioned, depth of field, right, is determined by the f-stop number. So if you increase the f-stop number, hence reducing the aperture opening, then its depth of field will be large. So let's look at this particular example, it will become clear. So if you don't look at this particular this particular information at the bottom, just look at this particular image. For this particular image here, do you think you are using a small f-stop number or a large f-stop number? You are using this one, I mean compare these two images. If you want an image like this, should you be using a small f-stop number or large f-stop number? Small f-stop number, huh? Because a small f-stop number means that your aperture opening is large. If your aperture opening is large, that means your depth of field is small. So if your depth of field is small, only this particular object will appear to be in focus. The background will be blurred. Okay, so this is if you use a small f-stop number. If you use a large f-stop number, your aperture opening will be small, depth of field is large, so both the foreground as well as the background will appear to be sharp. Okay, so the same rationale actually applies here. Right, if you use a small f-stop number, okay, your aperture opening is large, right, therefore this depth of field is smaller, right, only the upper part is stay in focus. Okay, if you use a larger f-stop number, okay, the aperture opening is small, depth of field is larger, so you can see both the top part as well as the lower part of these limbs will appear to be sharp or in focus. Right, so that's the basic relationship between depth of field and the f-stop number. Okay, I'll stop here. We'll continue next week.